Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Samir Mahmoudi, and I'm so glad I will be able to share some parts of my dissertation research with you today. So the title of the paper is The Propagation of Local Credit Shocks, Evidence from Hurricane Katrina. In this paper, I will be showing you that a local credit shock emanating from Hurricane Katrina propagated across space through banks' internal networks. Second, this propagation led to credit and real market effects in some very distant, undamaged markets in the United States. In other words, this paper shows that local shocks in a highly integrated banking system are no longer local. They do have national effects and they do propagate across space. So I can reformulate the research question very easily, which is, did Katrina impact housing markets in the... If yes, what is the channel and how did it happen? So this is the Katrina-related property damage. The most devastated areas were New Orleans and the surrounding areas in the around the Gulf Coast. As we go further north, the damage attenuates, and there is also some minor damage in southern Florida and some parts of western Alabama. So here I claim that each local market in the United States, each undamaged local market in the United States has some sort of financial connection with Katrina impacted areas. So how do I define financial connectedness to Katrina impacted areas? Basically, I say that a market is financially connected to Katrina impacted areas if its supply of loans, the supply of loans in this particular local market, is being provided by some financial institutions that also have a strong financial footprint in Katrina hit areas. So a financial connection between two geographic areas is basically and through common banks or common financial institutions that serve both markets simultaneously. So here's the darkest red areas are the areas with the strongest financial connection to Katrina impacted areas. And as we go yellow, this financial connection becomes smaller. Notice that in this reduced map of the US, I removed the Katrina impacted states, and I removed the states that are surrounding, the 4 states surrounding Katrina impacted states. So we will be looking at areas that are geographically very distant, very far away from the location of the initial shock of the storm, which is mainly intended to reduce any labor market spillovers or any other confounder other than the financial link. So next, I use the following identification strategy. So I compare neighboring markets. So they are either neighboring counties within the same core-based statistical area, which is a generic term for metro or micropolitan statistical area, or I compare different CBSAs within the same state. So either neighboring CBSAs within the same state or neighboring counties within the same CBSAs. And they are both in the undamaged markets. What this graph shows is that after the storm compared to before the storms, the areas that are highly financially connected to Katrina damaged regions declined in housing prices relative to the areas that are less financially connected to Katrina damaged areas. And the vertical red line is the exact timing of the storm, not exactly, but the quarter of the storm. So 2005, third quarter, and we know that the storm occurred in August 2005. And the y-axis is house price index. So the question of this paper is, why did that happen? And how did that happen? Okay, so how and why? So in order to respond to that question, so this was the first observation in the paper, or the paper is motivated by these graphs. The rest of the paper is basically the explanation of the mechanism. So the mechanism is the following. It's a three-legged chain. So the first one is a mortgage and housing boom occurred in Katrina damaged areas following the storm, which is basically, it corresponds to the significant rebuilding activities that took place immediately after the storm to rebuild these communities. So I'll be showing a surge in the number of building permits issued by local authorities immediately after the storm. This increase in the number of houses being supplied translated into an abnormal growth of the housing stock. And in order to buy these houses, people had to borrow. So I will show an increase in loan origination volumes, an abnormal growth of the of housing prices in the impacted areas. And I will show that banks raised their loan acceptance rates, so a measure of loan supply in these areas. So that's what I mean by a local shock or a local boom. Second, financially constrained multi-market banks. So these common banks that link different local markets, they responded to this local boom by intensifying their market entry and increasing their loan supply in Katrina damaged local markets. Unfortunately, this response happened at the expense of the undamaged regions. So they had to reduce their loan supply in other areas in order to respond to the rebuilding needs of the damaged areas. This contraction dampened housing prices and construction in the undamaged areas, and of course, the areas that were highly connected financially to Katrina damaged areas are the ones that suffered the most. So now I have two additional observations to make. So the areas that have a high share of community banks, so small local banks, also known as community banks, they suffered less from this reallocation, basically because smaller and local banks are less exposed to external shocks because they are less exposed to very distant markets. Second, the areas that have high housing supply elasticity, so the area where it is easy to build a house, responded in quantities and in prices. The areas with tighter housing market, with inelastic housing markets, were unable to respond in quantities, so the response was mainly a price response. Okay, so now I provide some evidence on the claims I made in the previous slides. So I was able to show you the ultimate result, but there are two links that I need to document. So booming housing and credit markets in disaster areas. So the proof of that is, first we see a surge in building permits issuance after the storm compared to before the storm. So the dashed vertical lines is the timing of the storm. This excess supply of houses translated into an abnormal growth of the housing stock, and it is sustainable because the rebuilding process took a lot of time and is probably still continuing. And housing prices also grew abnormally for an extended period of time after the storm. So credit markets in the damaged areas, they had to follow. So excess supply of loans, so the left figure shows that loan approval rates in disaster areas increased significantly after the storm. This excess loan approval rate led to an abnormal growth of mortgage credit volumes at the local level. So we see that mortgage credit kept growing also for an extended period of time and significantly after the storm. So that's the first point. So how did banks respond to this local booms? So here, for simplicity, I had to divide banks into two categories. So the first one is the category of banks I call outsiders. So the banks that are headquartered very far away from the of the hurricane. So banks headquartered outside of the south. So what I see here is that prior to the storm, so here the outcome value I'm looking at is market entry, where market entry is defined as having originated at least one loan in disaster areas at a given year. I see that prior to the storm, outsider banks, they are not more likely to enter disaster markets than entering other markets. After the storm, outsider banks are more likely to enter disaster markets compared to entering non-disaster markets. So there is a reallocation of credit in the sense that Katrina damaged areas become more attractive for outsiders than undamaged markets. The other category of banks are the insiders. So banks that used to be around in Katrina damaged areas before the storm. So how do these banks behave? I show that these banks, they retract from the other areas, so they reduce the loan approval rates immediately after the storm in the undamaged regions. So policy implications. First, the effects of natural disasters, they propagate, so they are no longer local as we used to think about them. Second, community banks, because of them being unexposed to external shocks, they were able to shield their local markets partially. Banks are financially constrained, so securitization did not fully alleviate this scarcity of resources, and there was a surge in loan retention rate, loans retained on the books in disaster areas. So the action of the government-sponsored enterprises did not absorb this excess lending. Disasters are tragic events for impacted communities, but for banks, they create significant business opportunities. So questions or discussions, if you are an outsider, did your bank reallocate or enter disaster markets after the storm? If you are an insider, what happened to your pre-storm loan supply in the undamaged areas? And finally, what policies do you suggest to ease these constraints and help these communities rebuild seamlessly? Thank you so much.